Do you love books? Do you wish you could hear some insights straight from the author themselves? Join Sam Hankin, your host, as he interviews top-selling book authors and dives into interesting and unforgettable discussions here at The Avid Reader.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of The Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop. Our guest today is Greene and Murphy, co-author with Ciara Greene of Memory Lane, The Perfectly Imperfect Ways We Remember. It's published by Princeton University Press. It will be released in March of this year. So, our memories are fully intact and fixed expressions of our past lives, right? Apparently, no, not at all. We construct them and reconstruct them each time we recall. Every time I remember the incident in which I got this scar at 3 years old, I alter its constituents, and it's already altered by my mom telling me how it happened, and I was only 3. But I do have a specific recall of every detail of that accident. But that plasticity and inaccuracy seemingly was naturally selected for us by nature itself. So a faulty memory is not necessarily a bad thing, but that flexibility can also cause harm substantially. As much of this book discusses the forensics and the courtroom arena, false memories, and pushy tactics by police officers and sometimes therapists. The storytelling and science of this book are what propel the reader through it, and its accessibility is such as to enjoyably lead the reader, as it did to me, even though I had to stay up later than I wanted to in a single sitting. So the hallmark of the book, which is mentioned at the beginning of the end, is that a second walk down memory lane is in fact another lane indeed. So welcome, Gillian. Thanks so much for joining us, and also for your co-author, Ciara, who's a professor, right?
Yeah, we both are. So I'm an associate professor of applied psychology at University College Cork in Ireland, and Ciara is the same in Dublin.
Okay. Yeah, where did I see psycho? It might have been in Wikipedia, or it might have been on the sidebar in Google, but
Must have been. Nope, never been a therapist. Very much coming from the other side, from the experimental cognitive psychology, running experiments kind of side of the house. So thank you for reading the book. Thank you for enjoying it. Apologies you stayed up late to read it, but good to hear you found it accessible.
Oh, very much so. And I love Princeton University Press, and its accessibility was not only because of the excellent writing, but because of the illustrations, the diagrams, and the case studies, which really it read like good fiction, actually.
Yeah, I sometimes think being an academic, it's wonderful, it's amazing. Obviously, like any profession, we complain about it to each other and to ourselves. We complain about the hard parts of the job, but I think the best part is that we all, if we're lucky, we get to study the thing that we find most interesting. And for me, that still is memory. I think it's fascinating. And here is the same, the book just poured out of us. It was so easy to write because we both teach on this subject, obviously a lot. And we both do research on it a lot, and we think about it and we talk about it, and you get a good sense for the most interesting anecdotes and the most pertinent points that you want to get across. But I think we're lucky. I think it would be much harder to have to communicate about, I don't know, the solar system or something dark matter, something that people can't understand. But everyone knows something about memory, like you said about yourself as a 3-year-old. We all have a touch point we can go back to.
And that's interesting because actually, I wouldn't call them trigger warnings, but there were flashpoints in the book where you actually do, because of the language in the book, remember an incident in your life and go, wait, is that how it happened? And then my brother and I totally disagree. No, mom wasn't there. No, that wasn't the toy. That wasn't the toy you were, just like you talk about in the barbecue. But one thing I was going to say was, I say this pontifically in every interview, as a bookseller, even though you're not supposed to judge a book by its cover, everyone who comes to the bookstore does exactly that. And you have an excellent title, and the Legos on the cover also go directly to formation and reconstruction of memory. So why don't we just start there, because it's an excellent title. It kind of gives an idea of what you see in the what you're going to see. It's like the outside of a jigsaw cover box. You know what's going to, you know what the big picture is
Like
going to be.
Tetris, kind of. It looks like Tetris to me as well. Yeah, that
Oh
kind of
yeah,
like
it
blocks
does.
falling into place, and yeah,
Yeah, Tetris and Legos.
yeah, it
Um,
does.
anyway, so okay, talk about the title. Why is it perfect? At the same time, it's imperfect. It's like an oxymoron.
Yes, yeah, the perfectly imperfect ways we remember. I think this goes to the starting point of kind of why we wrote the book and why we wrote the book the way that we did. We're not the first people to write a book about memory, and often, popular science books about memory and even science communication about memory, myself included, often you sort of become a bit doom and gloom. You become kind of, oh, look how terrible it is. It's the worst, and you can't trust anything. And that kind of is the message, is that we're so terrible and everything is an illusion and memory is terrible and everyone's going to go, be convicted for crimes they didn't commit. And that can kind of be the tone. And then I find, when I teach on my subject or when I think about it myself, often then the response to that is like, God, I thought evolution would have done a better job than that. Why are we so bad at remembering? Why aren't we better? And then I find in response to that, I will say, oh no, but there's an upside to all of these flaws. And I think maybe historically, in the way that we communicate about memory science, we haven't quite captured both of those things together, because obviously the flaws are kind of more interesting and more dramatic. You talk about wrongful convictions, and you talk about completely false memories, and you talk about, planting memories in people who are unsuspecting and things like that. That's all very dramatic. But what we wanted to achieve in this book, I suppose, is that balance of saying, yeah, it's imperfect, but we did actually get to this point for a reason, and it is perfectly imperfect. And though our memories are flawed, and sometimes we have too high expectations of what our memories can do, they do still do a good job. We're sitting here, you remember the book that you read, you remember when you were 3 years old, you have relationships, you have habits, you have attitudes, like all of those things are founded on memory. And so it's imperfect, but perfectly imperfect, is what we say.
Well, so continuing with the cover, then, you were just saying Tetris. I was saying Legos because you talk about Legos, and even like Jenga. I was thinking about,
Yeah.
but so start with you start with a Lego tower that's perfectly formed. It has a geometric shape, and then in your illustration, which I should be able to show, but I can't. In your illustration, you show how it I was thinking, okay, what's the word? Disintegrates? No. How it reconsolidates? No. What is it doing in those three pictures?
Yeah, it changes. So I suppose maybe to start with, when people talk about memory, I suppose and anyone listening, you might think of your memory. I think for me, the metaphor I would use in my mind before I became interested in memory, I probably think of my memories like books on a shelf, like you have behind you here. I think I would think of them like that. And if you said to me, when was the first time you went to Disneyland? I think I find the Disneyland section of the shelf and I pull out that memory, I look at it, I fold it back up and I put it away. And I think a lot of this goes back to Aristotle, all these different metaphors of memory. They used to talk about memory as a wax seal, and experience was the print that was pressed into the wax seal. And we think of it as storage, that you store it and then you take it out and then you put it back. And I suppose what we know now from kind of decades of mostly experimental memory research is that it's not like that at all. So there is no one place in your brain that memories are stored. This idea of these bookshelves where the memories are, it just doesn't exist. Instead, every time you recall something, you essentially build the memory from scratch. That's why we talk about a Lego tower. So you've got all the little pieces of the memory, your memory of having an accident as a child. You'll have kind of what age you were, where you were, who was there, how you felt, maybe what it smelled like, what the weather was like. You've got all these little blocks and you build it all up. And if you think of each of those pieces, each of those Lego blocks as literally kind of scattered across your brain, they're in all different locations. And then to remember that memory as you go along, you're sort of building the Lego tower. You're pulling out all those pieces like a Jenga tower, like a Jenga block. You're building it all up, and then that is the memory. And you do that every time you remember something. And so
Well,
if you imagine,
go ahead.
Yeah, if you imagine you have to do that, it becomes much easier to understand how memories change and flex, and blocks get left out and new blocks get added in that actually weren't there to begin with. If you think of memory as this active process, this constructive process, none of this makes any sense if you think of it like books on a library shelf. But if you think of it as construction, that helps us to understand how memories can distort and change in a way that is completely unknown to us. We don't realize it's happening at all.
That reminds me, like in the beginning of the book, you say what the book is not. It's not about Alzheimer's. It's not about decline in memory. It's good that you set that out too. And then, but you do have to lay a foundation of science to a certain extent. And the core of it, well, the cerebral cortex, yes, definitely involved. But you talk about the hippocampus and you talk about the unfortunate Henry Molaison. Is that how you pronounce it? So talk about how, the different kinds of memory, how to do something, ride a bike, or what happened, yesterday, what I had for lunch. And, you have this short-term memory that's stored in the hippocampus and they mediate it and decide, okay, maybe this is one I'll send over here. And then this one, we don't really need it. So let's just get rid of it. Talk about that, 'cause it's fascinating.
Yeah, so there's all different kinds. Again, sometimes the language we use can be kind of imprecise. We talk about memory like it's just one thing, and actually you're talking about loads of different things. So as you said, if you were doing your introductory memory 101 lesson in a psychology degree, you would start off by making the distinction between different types of memory. And the most basic kind of classification we would make is between declarative and non-declarative memory. And it's exactly what it sounds like. Declarative memory are memories that you can declare, you can tell me about them. So anything anything you can tell me, that's declarative. Non-declarative is something you can't tell me. So that is things like procedural memories, like you know how to tie your shoes. You can vocalize that, but you also just know how to do it. You know how to ride a bike, kind of skills, things like that. Those are non-declarative. And then within declarative memories, we have kind of two other, main categories we would talk about, and that's semantic memories and episodic memories. Semantic memories are memories just for facts. If I asked you who is the current president, you may or may not want to talk about it, but you do know. If I asked you, something like, what fruit contains a lot of vitamin C? Like you're able to just do these are just knowledge. You don't remember when you learned that. You don't remember kind of how you know it. You just know that you know it. So that's semantic knowledge. Language, your vocabulary, things like that are all part of your semantic memory. And then the last one I'm going to talk about is episodic memory, and that's what Ciara and I mostly study. Episodic memory is exactly what it sounds like. It's memory for episodes, so memories for kind of contained, discrete events. And specifically, we both study autobiographical memory a lot. And again, that's exactly what it sounds like. That's memories from your own life. So all of the book really is focused on autobiographical memory, except for that introductory chapter where we just situate you into what we're looking at and what we're talking about and not talking about.
Well, it's funny because when you talk about episodic and autobiographical, I think of like your internal memoir of your life. Yeah. Memoirs always have a lot of lies in them. And you talk about Mark Twain saying, never let the truth ruin a good story.
Yeah.
I kind of lived that life. I feel, if I'm on an airplane and I meet somebody and we're chatting, if I'm telling one of my stories about something that happened to me, I like to embellish it. I'm never going to see him again. And it's much more entertaining if I embellish it.
Yes, absolutely. And actually, a colleague of mine, I was speaking to him the other day, he does research on evolutionary psychology. It's very different to what I do. But I was talking to him about storytelling and lies and errors in storytelling and embellishing. And he said that I might be misrepresenting this now, this is secondhand, but he said that there's some interesting evidence across lots of cultures and kind of far-flung tribes that we have kind of two different types of storytelling in human nature. And that during the day, we tend to tell factual information. We tell each other, things, here's where to get the food, here's what happened, that kind of thing. And then at nighttime, we tell these embellished, creative, kind of fantasy-filled legends and things like that. And that happens around a fireside. And there's all kinds of very interesting evolutionary psychology research into that. And yes, we live in an era of misinformation. And yes, people are concerned about it all the time. But sometimes people can maybe throw the baby out with the bathwater and assume that what we need is absolute truth at all times and absolute accuracy, and we need to live like video recorders and never misremember something. And that's kind of another key point in the book, is that forgetting things, misremembering things, remembering them differently, sometimes it's really good for you. Sometimes it makes you happier. Sometimes it makes you healthier. And again, coming back to that idea of kind of, we got here for a reason, the way that we are for a reason, it's worth thinking about.
Yeah, somewhere towards the end of the book, you talk about, it's not the word forgiveness, but what's the word you use?
Humility, I think. It was, oh yeah, acceptance and humility.
Yeah, you shouldn't put yourself down because, oh, I think I screwed that up. I don't think I remembered that right. No, it's part of human nature.
Absolutely. And that's another really common thing. I think if I ever give public talks, there's always a person who's a little bit older will come to me and say, yes, I know you said mistakes are normal, but for me, I think they're worrying. And I think it means I'm going to develop Alzheimer's. And I would tell that person to speak to their doctor. I'm not the one to tell them if they are or they aren't. But I think as we get older, in particular, a lot of us become a bit hypersensitive to these mistakes and these errors. And they might be things that you were doing your whole life, but you just didn't pay any attention to them when you didn't think that they were meaningful. And it can be easy to read too much into it. And people, yeah, they just castigate themselves absolutely. And so I have a terrible memory and I misremembered this, and that's okay. We're not meant to be recorders of absolute accuracy.
Yeah, being kind of a professional hypochondriac, every time I lose my keys, I feel as if, well, especially at my age, I mean, it's only natural. But yeah, I've been losing my keys all my life, literally.
Yeah.
Well, that's, I said I jump around, and I do, and I apologize. But
No.
when you talk about episodic and autobiographical, and you were just talking about remembering things, talk about that unfortunate gentleman. Oh, it's really interesting that doctors and professionals learn a lot, because it's like war injuries.
Yeah.
It's horrible that they happen, but doctors learn so much more when trauma on the field allows them to try experimental techniques. And this guy, Henry, what happened to him? He had these, you tell the story.
Yeah. So again, this is really famous. He's probably one of the most famous people in psychology, because everyone learns about him initially. I think probably anyone in neuroscience would learn about him as well. So he used to have terrible seizures, really, really bad seizures, and they tried different methods to try to cure them. And finally, they said, look, we have this idea of this kind of experimental surgery, and they aim to kind of cut a part of the brain that kind of connects both sides of the brain. And in the process, they removed his hippocampus. And I suppose at this point in time, it wasn't well understood what the hippocampus did. And so they took it out, the seizures went away, and they thought, great. And, he seemed fine. He was talking, he was fine. He knew who he was. He knew everything like that. And people thought, great, we've cured his seizures. And then unfortunately, what they realized, in removing his hippocampus, he became unable to form new episodic memories. So he still remembered things that he knew before he had the surgery. He knew who he was. He knew where he came from. He retained the skills that he had before. So like I say, he could tie his shoes. He could ride a bike. But he couldn't learn new things. If you met him today, he wouldn't remember who you were tomorrow. You could also teach him. So one thing they did learn, it was very informative to our classifications of memory, is that he was able to learn new skills. He just couldn't remember learning them. So they had him learn a couple of very difficult kind of procedural tasks. So one of them is called the mirror tracing task. And you can probably try this yourself at home if you're interested. So you essentially, if you imagine, it's he's sort of looking into a mirror at an angle, and he's looking at a shape, let's say a star. And then he, while looking in the mirror, has to trace the star without making a mistake. And it's really difficult because you're having to move your hand backwards to what it looks like to you in the mirror. And that mightn't sound that difficult, but it's very difficult to learn the skill of it. And they found that he got faster and faster and faster every day that he did it, because he learned to get better at it, but he had no memory of doing it. Each day he arrived at the lab, he didn't remember who the scientist was, he didn't remember what the task was, he needed all the instructions given to him again and again, but he did actually get better at it. And so that suggests to us that, you know, something that people commonly call kind of muscle memory, it's not stored in your muscles. It is definitely still stored in your brain. But procedural memory, that idea that that is separate and that is stored separately, and it doesn't involve the hippocampus in the same way as episodic memory, because he was able to continue to learn new procedural memories. But I mean, ultimately, it's a very sad story, but it was really informative to memory researchers in terms of understanding that. So he lost his hippocampus, he lost his ability to make new memories, but he didn't lose the memories he already had. So that says to us that there's a distinction in between where memories are made versus where they're stored.
Which is the cortex.
Yes.
So, and again, jumping around. So you were talking about the task that I could try at home. And you do give us tasks in the book. And sometimes they were frustrating because you couldn't do them. Like the one with the blank keyboard, you know,
Yeah.
and we say, turn the page. And I'm waiting. I don't really want to turn the page because I don't think I'm going to be able to do it. And so you have this blank keyboard and you ask me to tell you metaphorically, what letter is this? And I know what a QWERTY keyboard is. I could probably find the QUERTY.
Yeah.
But that, no, but I know. And you talk about, you have to have some typing skills, otherwise you wouldn't understand it at all. But and the other one,
it's funny that you said how difficult that was, and that you're saying I could find the Q and the W and the E. I think I would be the same. If I tried to do it very actively, very consciously, I would find it really difficult. If I said, okay, what's there now? What's there? Impossible. If I close my eyes and I put out my hands and I say, imagine I think of a word with that letter in it, and I think whatever the letter is, let's say it's N, I might say, imagine I'm typing and I go A-N, and suddenly your finger will go to exactly the right place. I think if you make it too conscious, too front of mind, you're going to find it really difficult. If you try to allow it become something a bit more automatic, you'd probably be able to do it.
Yeah, there's a law like the Peter principle that if you pay attention to a task that you normally do not pay attention to, you find that you do it worse. Like carrying a glass of water. If you don't look at it, you don't spill it. If you look at it, you obviously do.
I think for me, it's driving when my husband is in the car because I'm a perfectly good driver. But I find when he's in the car and I know he is attending to what I'm doing, I find I over concentrate on what I'm doing, and sometimes I make a ridiculous mistake, and that I'm saying, no, I don't normally do this, I swear.
In America, police officers say they would much rather encounter a drunk driver than a driver who's texting, because as we're talking about tasks, a drunk driver is still driving, whereas someone who's texting while he's driving isn't driving at all.
Yeah, we have this. Again, I suppose I also study attention, or a lot of my PhD was about attention when driving. Actually, we have a big driving simulator here, and I used to get people to do 2 tasks at once. And I definitely agree with people who argue that the word multitasking is just kind of nonsense, that we can't multitask. We can't do 2 things at once. At best, you are hopping between 2 tasks as quick as you can. You're never actually doing both at the same time. And so people like to think they're texting while they're driving, but they're not. They're texting instead of driving. You are entirely taking your attention off the road.
And you devote a whole chapter to that. Look, even without my notes, I can remember. We can talk about the driving simulator and the polar bear, as well as the white T-shirts and the black T-shirts.
Yeah, we've done loads of different experiments, I suppose, so I suppose when people think about memory and they think about forgetting, something that they might not factor into the equation is the fact that far from, so the amount that we remember and forget is one thing, but it's tip of the iceberg compared to the amount that we just don't pay attention to. And if you don't pay attention to something, you can't remember it. And I think, again, in TV shows, sometimes they'll have people say, oh, I know I was at a gala and I was speaking with you, but if I really concentrate and remember, I'll remember this conversation happening on the other side of the hall. And it's impossible. You weren't paying attention. You can't take it in. And so, we've done lots of experiments in the driving simulator. Fun, sometimes kind of wacky experiments where we study something called inattentional blindness. And this is where essentially you can look at something but not see it. And typically it's because it's unexpected and because your attention was engaged somewhere else. So we give people a task to do in the driving simulator. They have to decide if their car will fit between gaps or not. It's I'd say a very common task here in Ireland. We have much smaller roads than you have in the US. And so you're often trying to decide, can I fit here? Do I need to go another way? And they're doing that. And that's a task that requires a lot of your attention. And as they're driving along, suddenly without any warning, there's a massive polar bear on one side of the road. And I think in a later trial, we had a dinosaur, and we did kind of wacky things on the road. And you'll find that, up to sometimes in these tasks could be 70–80% of people just won't see this very surprising item. And I suppose this ties into a key kind of theme of the book, is that we often have these really unrealistic expectations of how our brains work, of how attention works and how memory works. And we hold people to account then. If someone said, I was driving and apparently a polar bear got loose from the zoo and I drove past it and I didn't see it, I think most of us internally would say, like, you're a terrible driver. If that's the case, you should have seen that. And actually, that's not the case. It's because they were concentrating hard on the task at hand that they weren't distracted by something off to the side. And you find, some even people who struggle with their attention, people with ADHD, often their problem is they're struggling to stay on task, and they're getting too distracted by things outside of the field and outside of the task that they're actually concentrating on. So like all these things, there's a trade-off, and we do tend to assume that if people are making these mistakes, then they're either lying or they're incompetent. And there was a minor political scandal in Ireland a few weeks ago. I heard it on the radio. It was about a leader of a political party that was photographed arriving at a kind of official event. And for various reasons I won't go into, there was a young man at the event also. And it was considered scandalous that he was there. And she was asked repeatedly, well, you saw him when you arrived and you didn't point it out to anyone. And, she was maybe less than 6 feet from him, but he was standing back and she was greeting other people and shaking their hands. And I heard the coverage of it on the radio and they couldn't move past it. They were like, he was right in front of her. There's no way she didn't see him. And I was listening going like, that's not the case. And especially when it comes to politics, we're very quick to assume, mistakes are always intentional and things like that. We don't really give people the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah. And a good portion of the book. Well, first, before we talk about the court system, which is kind of a nomen for all of what we've been talking about, because the same things that happen there happen to us every day. And what you're saying is, with regard to what we see, what we remember, what we observe, what we perceive, evolution, once again, is helping us out, because if we perceived everything, then we would not survive, because we wouldn't be able to concentrate on the important things. Like the people who have, what's the acronym, the initials for the woman who remembers every day of her life?
Oh, HSAM. Yeah, exactly. Highly superior autobiographical memory. These are people who remember, pretty much everything that happened to them personally. It'll be after the age of, a particular age of childhood, and then they'll say, I remember. And so you can say to them, tell me about every 3rd of June you can ever remember. And they'll say, oh, well, the last one was sunny, and the one before that I went to the cinema, and they can just remember things like that. And it's easy for us to get jealous of that. When you hear about it first, it sounds amazing, and you think, oh, I would be so successful if I had a memory like that. We all assume maybe you would on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire or something. But actually, in fact, these people, often report that it's a bit of a struggle. They're overwhelmed with memories. Everything they see triggers their memories. They tend to be, average students. There's not really good experimental evidence of this, but they do anecdotally report that they find it harder to move on from, betrayals, heartbreak, fallouts with friends, because the whole experience feels as fresh for them, as it did the day it happened. They haven't forgotten, time heals all wounds, but only really if you're able to move on and change how you think about it. And so it's a good example of how we might think that being a HSAM, having this highly superior memory, would be a more evolved state, but actually they're a very good example to us of why we do function the way that we do, and why it actually is perfectly imperfect, as we say.
So those people are exactly the opposite of HM, the famous guy.
Kind of, not really, because it's in a different way. And, it's very close, I suppose. Yeah, in that I suppose HM couldn't form new episodic memories, whereas these people kind of they can't not form them. Everything that happens to them is remembered more or less. It has to be kind of personally significant to them. You know, it has to be something that they know. They wouldn't be so necessarily good with trivia, but it is kind of the events of their own lives they know really well. Hence the A there for autobiographical memory.
Oh, here's a question. You know, uh, like we were talking about my past memories, I know that they're not exactly what happened. And if my brother tells me that's not what happened, I go, well, he's just as likely as not to be correct.
Mhm.
So these people, the HSAM people, is their memory of lunch more distinct, not as reconstructed?
No, and this is my favorite factoid. They are so we are talking about a tiny group of people. There's probably 100, 120 of them have ever been identified, right? It's a really, really niche group of people. I'm sure there's a lot more out there that just haven't been found, essentially. But what we do know about these people is fascinating because yes, they have incredible memories. They seem to, some people argue we shouldn't think of them as having, you know, an exceptional ability to remember. It's actually that they have an inability to forget. And that's important because we find the ways in which they remember are exactly the same as the rest of us. So a big portion of the book is dedicated to misinformation and false memories and how our memories change and distort, and we can even have false memories for events that never happened. And we do know that HSAMs suffer from those to the exact same extent.
Okay.
And so there is not a classification of human on this earth that we've ever found that doesn't form false memories, that whose memories do not get distorted, which I think really underpins this idea that it's possibly adaptive, evolutionary. If you see something that persistent across nature, there has to be something to it.
It's fascinating. It's fascinating because it's who we are,
Yes.
and who we are is not exactly what reality was at the time. So what
Yeah.
they're doing is the same thing with as with the picnic. They don't know whether Uncle Henry handed them the hot dog or Aunt Mildred. They know who it was. It just may
Yeah.
not be right.
Yep. Which is, I think, we repeat it, I think, a few times in the book. It underscores the idea that these false memories maybe are a feature and not a bug. If you're seeing this just arise in a few kind of stray populations here and there, there's lots of things humans do that are weird and our system's gone awry, and we might think of them as disorders or giftedness or something like that. But something that we see everywhere across cultures, across time, I think you have to concede with the idea that it might be intentional. That's not to say that all memory scientists think that. I think that, and I'm kind of embarking on a lot of work to try to demonstrate that more strongly empirically. But there would be another kind of school of thought that would suggest that it's not that the false memories themselves are beneficial, it's that they're a side effect of something else that's beneficial. And so the other thing that's beneficial is this ability to do what we call mental time travel. So I could say to you, what if you had never met your wife? How would your life be different? Or I could say to you, where are you going to be in 6 months' time? And so to do both of those things, you have to either travel forward in time to a hypothetical future, or you have to delve into and construct a kind of hypothetical past to do both of those things. And so humans can do this mental time travel, and it's amazing, and it confers obvious advantages for planning and learning and reflecting. And so, you know, there's another theory that so we know basically if we put you in an MRI scanner and you engage in that kind of mental time travel, the same parts of your brain that light up are the parts that we use for remembering. So it's the architecture of memory that we use to imagine the future and imagine the past. And so there's an idea, I suppose, that in enabling memory to be flexible enough to do this mental time travel, that maybe opened a door that allows for our memories to get distorted in day-to-day life as well. But truthfully, we don't really know exactly why we form false memories just yet.
Well, that reminds me, when you said architecture, that reminded me of the concept of the schema, because
Mhm.
schema is like this framework that we use in order to plaster on the memories. But the schema, what confused me about the schema, in order to have a schema, you have to generally know if you have a schema of what a circus is. It
Mhm.
doesn't mean that the clown was wearing a green jacket. It just means
Yeah.
that you know what a circus is like, but you have to know what a circus is like before you can form the schema of what a circus is. And how is that
Yes.
schema necessarily accurate?
I suppose the way we build them is sometimes through our own personal experience, but also just through culture. You know, I think I've maybe been to the circus once, possibly. I'm not even sure if I have, maybe as a child. They're maybe not as common here. But yet I have an idea of what a circus is, and most of that is absorbed through media. And so we know, like, as you say, schemata form a really important basis for how we form our memories. And we're much more likely to misremember items that should be in that schema. So if I tried to mislead you, you went to a circus and there was no animals, and I could, after the fact, try to convince you that there actually was a lion at the circus. Or I could try to convince you that there was a crocodile at the circus. I'm going to have way more success with planting the memory of a lion than I am the crocodile, because a lion fits with our schema of a circus. So, like, to me, I think a lion, an elephant, maybe, gymnastics, a trapeze, that kind of thing, all of those, it makes sense. That's where they should be. Whereas when we try to kind of wedge something in that doesn't belong in that schema, it's going to be more difficult. And again, that maybe sounds like a bad thing, and it can be really problematic when it comes to stereotypes, when it comes to racial bias. Like, this is how we inform ourselves about the world, and it's where we're most susceptible to kind of misinformation or post-event information. But also, these things are useful. They're the product of experience. They're kind of mental shortcuts that speed up the efficiency of our moving through the world and our forming memories. So as ever, it's a trade-off between those two things.
Well, I was about to pivot to that second part of the book that has much more, I don't know, it's difficult for the reader because there's so many people that were hurt or in prison for life or die in prison because of this kind of inaccuracy, misrepresentation, or intentional attempts to convict somebody who they know was innocent. So two things. Well, probably the best thing for the listener here would be the Lost in the Mall situation. Or before we even begin that, the one that really got to me was if a police officer says to you, "Where was the gun?" as opposed to "Was there a gun?"
Or where was I like, did you see a gun versus did you see the gun? The and the, you've got people twice as likely to misremember when you use the.
And I realized I would be one of them.
Yeah.
That's where the book really gets to you, is because, like I said earlier, when you assign the tasks to us and you realize, oh, I can't do that, I also could easily be influenced. I know I have been, and I'm a lawyer as well. So I know that's the other thing. I know I was guilty of some of the same tactics, because all lawyers are, because they're zealously representing the system or their client. But if you talk about the Lost in the Mall, that gives an idea of repressed memory and what it really is.
Yeah. So this is going to sound very exciting, but in the 90s, there was this kind of period of extreme debate between psychologists, and it was called the memory wars, which is a very dramatic term for what was essentially just arguments between academics and clinicians. But you might be familiar with the Satanic Panic, which was a period, again, in America, kind of in the 80s, where there were kind of widespread beliefs of ritual satanic abuse happening across the country. And at the same time, there was a rise in people going to therapy and undergoing what we would now recognize as very suggestive forms of therapy, hypnosis, regression, that kind of thing. And so what followed from that was this enormous increase in people reporting recovered memories of often satanic ritual abuse that they had suffered, typically at the hands of their parents. And what's really important to classify here, you probably saw it in the book, we're very careful in how we handle this, because we're talking about a really specific kind of memory here. There are lots of people who experience, say, some form of abuse as a child, and they don't come forward until they're an adult. They might not tell anyone, or they might not actually recognize that what happened to them was abuse. And nothing we're saying here is intended to cast doubt on that or question that in any way at all. What we're talking about is a really, really specific type of case. So you're talking about someone who typically would go to a therapist because of an unrelated issue. They might be having problems in their marriage, or, they might have an eating disorder. They're going to therapy for something going on with them currently. And then they work with a therapist who essentially encourages them to speculate and to dig at the root of them, and might suggest to them a few times, I think you might have been abused as a child, and I think you need to work at recovering that memory. I think you need to try and recall it. I think you'll be healed by recalling it, that kind of thing. And no one in this is trying to do anyone any harm. The therapists, thought they were helping. They thought they would help cure the patient. The patient just wants to get at the truth. But what many people, including myself, believe really happened there is that they were actually planting false memories. And so there was this rise of all these cases in the court, and often, they would be uncorroborated, often kind of fantastical. They would say, I remember, I was abused by my parents and they murdered babies in front of me. And often they would be, contain these kind of mad details that would seem difficult to have kept secret, say, at the time. And so, in the context of all of this, then people started to wonder, could memory really be swayed just by conversation with someone? Could that really happen? Could someone really come to misremember an event from their childhood just from talking to someone? And so Professor Elizabeth Loftus, who is mega famous in this area of memory, herself and Jacqueline Pickrell ran this initial study where it's called the Lost in the Mall study. And it's, again, one of the most famous studies in psychology. And it's really simple. Okay, so we replicated this last year because the original study was quite small. So we actually recently replicated it just to show how it worked with a lot more people. And essentially what happens is, if you were a participant in the Lost in the Mall study, you come to me and you say, I want to take part in this study. You sign up and you think you're taking part in a study of how you remember your childhood. And we say, we're just going to talk about some things that happened to you as a child, and we're interested in how you remember them and how much you remember. And then I ask for permission to get in touch with your caregiver. It might be a mother, it might be an older brother, someone who knew you as a child. And I get in touch with them. They tell me about 3 maybe true events from your childhood. So they'll say he had an accident, he got a scar. They'll say another day he fell into the pond in the local pool. And anyway, we'll get this kind of series of stories from your childhood. We also ask them to confirm that you never got lost in a mall as a child. And that's often the hardest part. You're trying to find people that never happened to, because it's not the most unusual event. Yeah, we say that. And then we also get details like, where did you shop as a child, and who would have gone with you when you went shopping, and things like that. What items in the store would have interested you. So we gather all this information from your family member. Then we come back to you again with a survey and we say, okay, so we found out about your childhood. Now we want you to talk about these events. And we show you the four events. 3 of them are real, but one of them is completely made up. And it tells this very detailed story of you getting lost in a shopping center, getting distressed. A kindly old lady finds you and she minds you, brings you back to your parent or whoever. They're relieved to see you, and you go off to this other department and they buy you this thing that's specific. And so we see then, when we present you with this idea of a memory, how people respond. And you'll get some people who say, yeah, I think I remember that. And you'll get lots of people who say, no, that never happened to me, because it didn't. And then following that kind of survey or initial kind of interview, there's then 2 interviews of about half an hour each, spaced a week apart, where you just do the same thing again. And there's no pressure. It's just the interviewer saying to you, I think if you really think about it, it's going to come back to you. And try to think, like, what do you think you might have been wearing? And what time of year was it? Was it cold? And they're just encouraging you to try to build up that memory. They're kind of giving you they're encouraging you to kind of pull out some more Lego blocks and continue to build that memory up, is kind of the idea. And what you find is typically it's around kind of 25 to 35% of people by the end of it will come to remember that, yes, they were lost in a mall. And they'll say, yeah, I'd be happy to testify to this fact. It definitely happened. And this was a landmark study because it showed for the first time that you really can plant memories of things that never happened. And the study is imperfect in lots of ways, not least because getting lost in a mall is obviously not comparable to witnessing satanic ritual abuse. Obviously, because of ethics, we could never try to implant memories of satanic ritual abuse, but there have been lots of other studies that have followed the same paradigm that Elizabeth Loftus kind of came up with, and have implanted other events, like you committed a crime and came into contact with the police, or you knocked over a punch bowl at a wedding and you spilled it all over the bride, like very specific events, and you'll get kind of 25 to 35% of people will form a false memory. And what's really important to note is that that doesn't mean that only 25% of people are susceptible to this. When most people hear about this, they think, yeah, that would happen to other people, but it wouldn't happen to me. And it only happens to, the stupid ones or something like that. And again, that's not the case. This is how we all work, and all of us are susceptible, depending on the circumstance and exactly the situation. So that's why Lost on the Mall is so famous, and it tells us a lot about memory.
It's interesting you mentioned ethics, and at the very end of the book, you make sure that you talk about the ethics, and there's three pillars to it. But since I don't have my notes, the only one I can remember is the last one, which is debriefing.
Yeah, so debriefing is really important. I'm trying to remember myself, the three of them. So we talk about the potential for distress, making sure that people kind of are okay. We don't plant memories of really terrible things. And so it does mean, there certainly are some people who believe that recovered memories are always accurate. Most memory scientists would say that our current models of memory just don't support that. And it's funny, it's kind of a cultural myth that's very hard to dispel, this idea of the body keeps the score, or that kind of idea that memory kind of stays within you, even if you don't consciously know it. It might wreak havoc on you in some way. These are really difficult things to kind of counter for people. And so people will always say, well, we can never be sure because you can never plant a memory for a thing that's as bad as the real life cases. But so nonetheless, yeah, distress, debriefing, and there's another D. Oh, deception, the fact that we have to lie to people is the other part of it. There are some open label false memory studies where you tell someone straight up, I'm going to try to plant a memory. And they're very interesting to see, and they do still succeed, like not at as high a rate. But typically we do lie to people to some extent. And so, yeah, we go to a lot of lengths to ensure that the way we do our studies are ethical. But also, like I say, you have to be really careful in how you communicate this, because you would never want to imply that we should not believe cases of historical sex abuse. And particularly, Ciara and I are both based in Ireland, and, there have been, it's decades now of enormous scandals of abuse being covered up by the church here. And we're more sensitive than most, I would say, to this idea and how important it is that we believe people who come forward. But at the same time, you can understand that these practices, these kinds of suggestive therapies, do so much harm to everyone. They do harm to the person who is wrongly accused, and they really do harm to the person that forms the false memory as well. And it kind of raises really interesting philosophical questions, that if I come to remember that I was the victim of ritual satanic abuse and I have a rich memory in my head and I believe it happened, like, is that the same as if it did happen? What's the difference to me? It's almost as if it did happen. There's hardly a difference between it happening and me remembering and believing it happened.
No,
And so it's
like,
really challenging.
yeah, I know. It's like this idea people have of the simulation, that this is just a simulation. And
Yeah.
and as we wind down, as we conclude, one thing I wanted to say is I know when I've read a good book, because when you close the cover, it's not ended. Because I just start, I mean, I hate the term rabbit hole, but I did that. And the other thing I kept thinking about, which is so scary, is with AI and with deep fakes, and as you say, with politics in the country, where there is essentially no truth. There's
Mm,
what someone says, and if he says it in a certain way, then a good percentage of Americans believe it. So
mm.
there's no specific truth. The truth is as malleable as he wants it to be. And so I don't know. I'm not asking you whether you're pessimistic or not, because I don't know what you'd be pessimistic about necessarily. But with all of this technology, and with AI maybe becoming artificial general intelligence, it seems like we're so much more at risk of being confused or watching something on TV that really isn't real at all. Do you guys talk about that?
We do. So it's interesting when you said, am I a pessimist? Because my answer is going to sound ludicrously optimistic, but it is genuinely what I believe. So I'm actually part of a wider people in technology research group here at my university, and I'm co-funded by a research center for software. And so I do think a lot about the intersection of cognition and technology. And My most of my findings and what is summarized in we have a chapter in the book on how our memories function in a digital world, and most of it is really pushing back against this narrative that AI and deepfakes and misinformation is going to fundamentally change cognitively how we work. It might have effects out in the world, but in terms of cognition. So I had a big grant that was studying deepfakes and false memories, and I got the grant on the basis of me saying, we already know we can form false memories with simple conversation, but imagine if I could make a deep fake of that thing. Imagine if I could make a deep fake of you being lost in a mall. Think how much more powerful that's going to be than me just speaking to you. And this is crazy. It's going to be like rocket fuel for false memories. And Elizabeth Loftus, who I work with and I consider a really wonderful friend, she was the same. We both thought this is going to be, so powerful. And so I got the grant. And I have run dozens of studies since then and found that deepfakes are doing nothing more than what text does. So I give you the text saying that you got lost in a mall, or I tell you that you once took a hot air balloon ride, or anything. I make a fake news story about Joe Biden saying XYZ, or I make a deepfake of him actually saying it. And we find that rates of belief, rates of false memory, the effects on political attitudes, voting intentions, everything is actually stronger or the same with text. And the conclusion there is not that we're immune to misinformation. We actually, people are, they fall for the stories, they form false memories, but they do it quite strongly with text. Often, I think the lesson there is that we oversubscribe a lot of power to technology, and we often fail to see how powerful kind of non-technological means can really be. And in some ways, that's actually really reassuring, because it's easy to buy into this narrative that we're in this new world and everything is different and all the stakes are raised. There's something really reassuring about saying, actually, this is just a continuation of all that we've had before. And cognitively at least, we're not talking about any kind of step change in terms of how powerful these forms of misinformation are, which means that when we come up with interventions for them or ways to combat them, I think it's nice to know it's not that we've landed into this whole new world. We're still kind of where we were before.
Well, yeah, I would have thought exactly the opposite, which is I'm glad
Yeah.
that you thought that too. But
Yeah.
yeah, and then
And it's
now,
not just me, by the way, in case anyone thinks my experiments are dodgy or something. It's people all over the world running similar experiments. We're all coming to the same conclusion that there's nothing special about
now that
deepfake.
you say it, you don't need technology because, like, if you read 1984, when one day you're fighting Eurasia and one day you're fighting,
Yeah.
yeah, or Putin's Russia, he doesn't need a great deal of technology, or Kim Jong-un's North Korea. The
Yeah.
reality they're living has nothing to do with reality.
And yeah, at the end, so we actually, one of my great students, John Toomey, he did this study of how deepfakes were discussed online during the war between Ukraine and Russia, during the very beginning of it. And he found that, most deepfakes were a bit silly and people just kind of having fun on the internet. But the real harm, and we're seeing it more and more now in the rest of our experiments, the harm of deepfakes is not so much that it makes you more likely to misremember something that didn't happen, it's that it makes you question the reality of things that really did happen. So this is called the liar's dividend, and it's the idea that liars benefit from being able to say, oh, you don't know what to believe, it's all wrong, it's all fake, and that actually is probably the more harmful effect of deepfakes, is just the fact that knowing of their existence casts a bit of doubt on media. And so we're working at the moment to develop interventions that can teach people about deepfakes, but not undermine their kind of belief in authenticity of real media, which is a tricky needle to thread.
Yeah, something happened to me last week. I was on a train going to a sporting event, and I was in the last car, and a young conductor who really wasn't in much of a uniform, he said, "You have to leave this car and go forward." And I said, "Why?" And he says, "Because the power's not working." And I said, "But the lights are on and the air conditioning's on." He goes, "Yeah, but the lights are flickering." And I'm thinking, okay, I'm not leaving. But everyone got up like lemmings because he was authority. And they just moved. And then we had to stand in this big crowd in the next car, which was more dangerous. And then I thought,
Mm.
what if the train stopped and didn't make it to the sporting event in time? Then that crowd would turn on the conductor.
Mm.
And it's so interesting to see how people, and that goes to a much more primitive schema, almost something hardwired in us.
we're obedient social creatures for the most part. And again, that's another one. So like I'm not a social psychologist, but it's another one where it seems terrible that we're like lemmings, like you say. And then you think, you know what, for much of human evolution, it benefits us that
Yeah.
we're to go with the crowd, and on the scale of evolution, it's not necessarily beneficial for us to always defect and always be individuals. There's a reason that it's difficult for us to do, you know?
Yeah, a herd of antelope have no defense against a lion, but they have safety in numbers because
Exactly.
the lion's only going to get one of them, and one's going to turn his head, and they're all going to go at the same time. So,
Exactly. Yeah. Most of our, I think I always enjoy taking an evolutionary lens to things that we just
yeah,
assume are flaws. I think it's useful, and it can be dangerous because sometimes it's easy to construct, what are called just so stories. It's easy to say, it must be this because this. And it's always important to remember that we evolved in a world that looks nothing like today, and we're talking about an enormous time scale for these kind of abilities to develop. So we do lots of things now that are completely unsuited and unfitting to the world that we're currently in, but it can still be a really useful jumping off point to think, at some point the pressures of evolution led us to this point, and in what way might that be useful? And like we say, it can help us to be maybe humble about our memory abilities, that they were not designed to be recording devices in any way, and we shouldn't expect them to be. So, like you say, there are lots of negative stories in the book, and some of them kind of heartbreaking, particular criminal cases and things like that. But almost all of them, we underscore the message that it's not really the person's memory's fault that this happened. It's that our expectations of memory were just too high in every case. We believed in eyewitness, or we thought memory would be less susceptible to misinformation than it was. And so, education, acceptance, those things are probably more important than anything else.
yeah, the word was humble. That's the right word, is humble. And then what that made me think of was equanimity. The idea that we should all, people don't do this, and I'm more of a fatalist than you. The idea is that we should remain calm and in the moment, and rather than immediately rush to judgment because of something we hear, spend the time to think calmly about it. But people don't do that.
No, I mean, and like I say, I literally research this for a living, and I still argue with my husband that like, no, this happened when, this happened with this and this happened with that. And it's not like you remember it, it's like I remember it. And ultimately it's pointless. Like the truth is somewhere in between those two things, and that's okay.
But the thing is, you're right.
Yeah, well, I think I'm right because I have a much better memory than he does. And so it's easy to think that I'm right, even though, who knows? And I have two small children, and my little boy is 3, and he has an incredible memory. Really, it's amazing to watch. He seems to remember every word someone said. But at the same time, he comes out with things sometimes that are just entirely confabulated, false memories. He's at that age at the minute where if you were to prompt him, I think I could talk him into anything. I could say, "Oh, remember we went to ninja camp today and you became a ninja." And within about 10 minutes, he'd be like, yeah, yeah, that's what I did. And he would repeat that story to someone else. He's the definition of an unreliable narrator at the moment. And
Yes.
it's fun to watch.
In my interviews, I deal with lots of characters that are unreliable narrators, and it works very well in novels because it keeps the reader on the edge of his seat because he
Yeah.
doesn't know.
Yeah.
And also it's like when you're a little kid and you have an imaginary friend. The imaginary friend is as real as anything in the
Yeah.
world.
Yeah. And how
Right.
amazing is that, that you have a
It
system
is.
that can do that? It's incredible.
Yeah. And I like to think of it's kind of hardwired, kind of not hardwired, but it kind of is hardwired to a certain extent.
Mm, yeah, I think it is. And, that's what I mean. Sometimes, we all think science and STEM and technology, and it's wonderful and it's amazing, but it doesn't mean that we have to work like that. Sometimes we want to model ourselves off these machines so much, and the perfection is in the flaws in humans, and we don't need to be so rigid in how we think about our abilities.
Right. And your optimism should go or could go, which again, I'm fatalistic about, that there's a certain humanity. I mean, you can have Sora do a video for you or some other program do an artwork for you like Dolly, but it might not have what you consider the humanity aspect of it in it,
Yeah.
at least yet.
Not yet. But even so, the fact that you can I could give you a few prompts right now and you could take your own little journey down memory lane and you could relive things in your mind and you could imagine how they might have gone another way. And we all do it all the time, so we don't reflect on how amazing that is. But it's incredible that you can build that in your head and no one else can see it and it's just for you. And it's amazing.
Yeah, now, there was a song, Memory Lane, back in the early 1900s, and the title is so great because it's so evocative, almost like the sense of smell is. Like the sense of smell of burning leaves takes you back so many different times and places,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's Halloween or fall or pumpkins.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, Memory Lane is a great title because it evokes nostalgia, because kind of inside, walking down memory lane is a path that's kind of blurry. You
Yeah.
you like it that way.
Yeah. And it's probably gentler for us that it is that way, you know?
Oh, just like
Yeah.
not remembering pain.
Yeah,
Which,
exactly. And we contrast that in a few places in the book that, sometimes people with PTSD, they're also having trouble forgetting. They're having trouble
right.
not bringing memories to mind, not moving on from them, not reframing things that happened, where our flexibility is really, really important and it helps us be happier. And sometimes happiness as an outcome sounds very wishy-washy, thinking, oh, it makes us happier. Why would evolution care about happiness? But it does, happier people live longer. Being happier is good for your body, good for your longevity. There's tons of studies that show that. And there's a reason that evolution might actually care about it.
I have like 100 questions in my mind, but we have to end this.
That's a good sign.
No, really, I do. And that's without my notes. So thank you so much, Gillian, and thank Ciara too for the two of you writing this book. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I'm looking forward to hand selling it when it appears in the store.
Thank you so much. And thank you for reading and for your wonderful questions. And yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of The Avid Reader. If you liked today's episode, check out more of our content on our channel.